Imagine two children sitting in the same classroom, same teacher, same textbooks, same neighborhood outside the window. Neither of them has a coin in their pocket, and yet 15 years from now, one of them will be drowning in debt, exhausted, wondering why the month always runs out before the money does. And the other will have built something from nothing, a business, a life, a kind of freedom that most people only see from the outside. We look at that second person and we call them lucky. We say the economy worked in their favor, or that they knew the right people, or that they were simply born with something the rest of us weren't. But here's what nobody tells you. The difference was never in their bank account. It was never in their connections, or their neighborhood, or the year they were born. The difference was happening somewhere far quieter and far more invisible than any of that. It was happening inside their mind long before a single dollar ever changed hands. And that's what we're going to sit with today. Most of us grew up carrying a belief so old, so familiar, that it feels less like a belief and more like the floor beneath our feet. The belief that life happens to us, that the economy is something done to you, that the government or your upbringing or the neighborhood you grew up in is the author of your story. And when things go wrong, and they do, they always do, this belief becomes a kind of anchor, not the kind that holds you steady, the kind that keeps you in place while everything else moves on without you. The person who builds wealth from zero has learned to let go of that anchor, not because their life was easier, not because the world was kinder to them, but because somewhere along the way they made a quiet and radical decision. They decided that no matter what was happening outside of them, they were the ones holding the steering wheel. Psychologists call this locus of control. The research is clear. People who believe they have agency over their outcomes are dramatically more likely to take action, persist through difficulty, and ultimately create change in their lives. It's not optimism. It's not positivity. It's something closer to a cold, clear-eyed responsibility. A willingness to say, even here, even in this, what can I do? And here's where it gets interesting, because most of us were never taught to see a problem as anything other than a problem. We were taught to avoid them, complain about them, wait for someone else to fix them. But the mind that builds from nothing has learned to look at a problem and ask a different question entirely. Not why is this happening to me? But who else is living with this, and what would it be worth to them if it were solved? Wealth, at its core, is not about accumulation. It's about translation. You take something that is painful or broken or missing in someone's life, and you translate it into something better. The money is just the echo of that exchange. This is why people who build real wealth from scratch are rarely chasing money directly. They're chasing problems. They're endlessly curious about what isn't working, about what people are quietly suffering through, about the gap between what exists and what could exist. And they've learned that if you can live inside that gap long enough to build something useful, the money finds you. But now we arrive at the part of this conversation that is perhaps the hardest to hear, because it touches something deeply human in all of us. Our brains are built for now, not for next year, not for a decade from now. For right now, this moment, this feeling. When we hold a little money, every part of us wants to feel it immediately, to spend it on something that says, I made it. I'm okay. Look, this impulse isn't weakness. It's ancient. It's the same wiring that kept our ancestors alive. Eat the food now, because you don't know if there will be food tomorrow. And in a world of genuine scarcity, that wiring makes perfect sense. But wealth creation requires something that runs completely against this current. It requires the ability to look at today's dollar and see tomorrow's 100. To delay the feeling of having arrived in order to actually get somewhere. The wealthy person who started with nothing didn't buy the luxury car with their first profit. They put it back. They reinvested. They understood in their bones that looking rich and being rich are entirely different destinations. Here is the midpoint of everything we're exploring today, and I want you to hold it for a moment. Before any strategy, before any investment, before any decision about where to put your money or your time, the real work is happening in the story you're telling yourself about what failure means. Because for most people, failure is a verdict. It says something true and permanent about who you are. It closes a door, it proves a fear. And so we avoid it at all costs, which means we avoid the very experiences that would teach us the most. But the person who builds from zero has rewritten that story completely. For them, failure is not a verdict, it is data. It is a message from reality saying, not that way, try again, differently. Every business that didn't work, every investment that went sideways, every pitch that landed on silence, these are not signs that they were wrong to try. They are the curriculum. This is what separates people at every stage of life. In their 20s, most people stop trying after the first real failure because the shame of it is too heavy to carry. But the person with the wealth-building mind absorbs that failure, integrates it, and comes back with something the person who never failed simply cannot have: real experience. By their 30s, the difference is already visible. By their 40s, it's a canyon, and running underneath all of this, quietly and consistently, is learning. Not the kind of learning that ends when school ends, the kind that never stops, the kind that treats every book, every conversation, every difficult experience as a deposit into an account that compounds over decades. Rich people, the ones who built it themselves, spend enormous portions of their day in the act of becoming more capable. But notice what they study. They don't learn randomly. They learn about their specific field deeply. They learn about human behavior, because understanding people is the foundation of every transaction, every relationship, every negotiation. And they learn about how money actually works, not as a moral object, not as a measure of worth, but as a mechanism, a system, a language. They see themselves the way a startup sees itself, as something that needs a daily update, as something that is never fully finished, never fully optimized, always capable of being better. There is a risk to everything we've talked about today, and I want to be careful here, because this word risk gets misused constantly. People think that wealth comes from being reckless, from betting everything, from a kind of wild courage that burns bridges and leaps without looking. That's not what this is. The person who builds real wealth from nothing takes risks, yes, but they are calibrated risks. They ask, what happens if this fails? Can I survive that? What do I gain if it works? Is the asymmetry in my favor? They feel fear. Of course they do. We all do, but they've learned to hold the fear without being held by it. They move toward their goal with the fear accompanying them, not stopping them. This is not the absence of emotion. It is emotional intelligence applied to action. And finally, we arrive at the deepest layer of all this, the one that most conversations about wealth never reach. What do you believe at the very bottom of yourself about money? For many of us, and this often comes from childhood, from religion, from watching adults struggle and fight over it, money carries a kind of moral weight. It is dirty or dangerous or the thing that ruins people. And if some quiet part of you holds that belief, your subconscious will work against you in ways you'll never fully see. You'll self-sabotage at the threshold of real success. You'll feel guilty for wanting more. You'll unconsciously push it away. The person who builds from zero has a different relationship with money entirely. Not worship, not obsession, something cleaner than that. They see money as a tool. A hammer doesn't have a moral value. A hammer just builds things. Money is the same. In hands guided by good values, it builds a better life, a better family, a better community. In hands guided by fear or resentment, it doesn't come at all. The love the game, but don't become a slave to it. That is the balance, and it is a balance that lives entirely in the mind. So here we are, two children, same classroom, same starting line. The difference was never in the world around them. It was in the world inside them, in how they held failure, in how they saw problems, in what they believed about money, about agency, about learning, about risk, in whether they were willing to stay uncomfortable long enough to become something new. None of this is about judgment. If you're reading this and you see parts of yourself in the person who is still struggling, that struggle doesn't say anything permanent about you. It says you're human. It says you were shaped by a world that didn't always teach these things. It says the beliefs you carry were probably given to you before you were old enough to choose them. The invitation isn't to immediately change. The invitation is simply to see, because before you build a fortune, you build a mind. And before you build a mind, you have to be honest about what's already living inside it. The real game has always been happening in there. And it started long before the first dollar ever appeared.